insinuated ourselves into their military establishments, ostensibly for the purpose of, quote unquote, promoting liberal democracy. And what we've got instead are people that are furious with us, that see us as aiding and abetting the French exploitation of their countries. They've rebelled against their leaders, who they see as colonial lackeys of France and the United States, and they're throwing us out. And frankly, Frank, we should get out. Africa is Africa. It's not part of us. It's not part of France. And the people that live there need to determine their destinies. We should demilitarize our relationship with those people. But I'm sure that we'll refuse to do that.
A lot of Americans read reports of the role that the Wagner Group played in the Niger coup, and it has there were even some reports of waving Russian flags and things of that nature. It does remind a lot of folks of the height of the Cold War, when the communist bloc and the West were sort of fighting for the latest third world country that would align with them as opposed to their adversary. Is this a new Cold War, not based on communism, but based on NATO versus everybody else?
You know, I think in some ways it is, in other ways it's not. You know, first of all, Wagner did not make this coup happen. This happened for reasons that have nothing to do with the Wagner Group. Secondly, yes, they've been waving Russian flags, and we saw the same sort of thing happen years ago with Nasser in Egypt, where when it became clear that the United States and the West were not going to provide Egypt with the assistance it needed, they simply turned in the direction of the Russians to get it. And remember that the Africans in particular, particularly sub-Saharan Africa, is not just the region that we're talking about, was recently granted effectively a debt holiday by Putin. He forgave a debt of $23 billion and said, look, you're not going to be able to pay it back, and it's too much of a struggle. Let's forget it and restart the clock at zero. Well, you can imagine that the people in the region were ecstatic. And that's really what they need to get out from under the debt bomb that hung over them. So he's made himself very popular there, and the Russians are popular. And I think you'll find that in most of the world, Latin America, Africa, Southeast Asia, even in Northeast Asia, people are very sympathetic to the Russians and what has happened to them in Ukraine, because they see Russia as under attack, which it is. Under attack by Ukraine and Ukraine's backers, the United States and NATO.
We are seeing a lot of talk of a new Russian-Chinese alliance. The news this week that the U.S. was dispatching 4 warships and a reconnaissance plane after China and Russia carried out a joint naval patrol near Alaska has a lot of folks a little bit worried. Some people are saying this Chinese-Russian flotilla involved 11 vessels, that's what the Wall Street Journal reported, and that it never entered U.S. waters, but it marked what some analysts are saying is a historical first in coming awfully close to U.S. waters in the Bering Sea. What do you think the significance of this joint patrol near Alaska is, and is this the latest step in a Russian-Chinese alliance?
The Russians have watched over many years as the United States Navy and its allies in NATO have held exercises in the Baltic. Those exercises involving aircraft and ground forces and naval forces, and the naval forces, of course, armed with nuclear weapons, have been exercising less than 50 miles from St. Petersburg, Russia. Now, technically, the Baltic is not a Russian lake, but you're very, very close in the Baltic, which is by ocean standards a large puddle, to Russia. The Russians have seen this go on for years. They've protested and wanted us to move our operations further west. We've ignored them. You have a similar situation with the Chinese. Over the last 20 years, we've been sending U.S. naval forces and aircraft either into or immediately along Chinese territorial waters. And more recently, we've sent naval forces routinely through the Strait of Taiwan, and those are, in international law, Chinese waters. Secondly, keep in mind that at no point is there any evidence or anything in the record to suggest that the Chinese have ever stopped a commercial vessel. So when you talk about freedom of navigation operations, those are usually reserved for waters where commercial ships have been at risk. No commercial ship has been at risk of attack by the Chinese. The Chinese are very dependent on access to the sea, down through the Strait of Malacca, and all the way to Africa and India. So the notion that somehow or another they would want to stop anything is, of course, absurd. So now, after all of this time, the Russians and the Chinese put together a very small force of 11 ships, probably a couple of submarines, and they've conducted an exercise in the North Pacific, far from U.S. territorial waters, but in an area where they haven't been previously. And the fact that they're Russian and Chinese trying to work out joint operations has raised some eyebrows. Well, I would argue that we have been behaving as a sort of schoolyard bully for years. And the schoolyard bully runs around and punches people in the face to keep them in line until somebody finally says, I've had enough, and hits him in the face. Then the schoolyard bully is upset, doesn't understand why there's any resistance. Well, I think that's what you've seen with Russia and China. They've had enough of us. And this is just a public demonstration of their readiness now to cooperate. And we should pay attention to it, because you hear fools in Washington on a routine basis talking about, well, you know, perhaps we should be prepared to go to war with Russia. Listen to Lindsey Graham. He makes these statements. He's not by any means the only one. Dan Sullivan from Alaska made an equally stupid statement about the events in the North Pacific. I have news for you. If you go to war with Russia, you will be at war today with Russia and China. If you go to war with China, you will be at war today with China and Russia. And by the way, I don't think they'll be alone. I think they will have lots of other nations that will cast their lot with them, because people are tired of the United States bullying them militarily, politically, and financially.
As far as Taiwan goes, we're now seeing reports that China released a TV documentary showcasing the Chinese Army's ability to attack Taiwan. And CBS Sunday Morning last Sunday, they did a piece in Taiwan, and they showed that a lot of people in Taiwan seem to be preparing for some sort of a war. Depending on what day you get President Biden, he says something to the effect of the United States is not going to sit idly by and let China invade Taiwan. And until those remarks get walked back from some of his staffers, it has a lot of people wondering, could we be headed towards an armed conflict with China as well as Russia? Understanding that it may not be likely to happen, what should the United States do if China moves militarily forward with a Taiwanese invasion?
Well, we absolutely should not try to move our forces 8,000 or 9,000 miles away from the United States to fight a war on China's doorstep. I argued against any intervention in Ukraine for the same reason. You don't want to fight a great power like Russia or a great power like China on the proverbial doorstep of those nations. We don't have the manpower. We don't have the military power to sustain ourselves that far from the United States in a collision with either of these states. You know, we act as though this is 1991. It's not. We are not the nation that we were in 1991. And they are not the same countries that they were in 1991. They are infinitely more powerful, more resilient, and more capable. We don't have any capabilities that they also do not have in some form. So the notion that you could wage a war over there and win third, you would very definitely lose it. So the right course of action right now is for us to stay away from Taiwan. The people on Taiwan don't want a war. They're not interested in it. The Chinese don't want to go to war with the people on Taiwan. The original date for reunification that was established by Xi was 2047. We are the ones that have been bringing people into Taiwan and providing them with modern weaponry. These things are red lines for the Chinese. Taiwan was the unsinkable aircraft carrier for the Imperial Japanese Armed Forces during World War II. All the major formations that invaded China, most of them were staged out of Taiwan, particularly for southern China. They're not going to tolerate any foreign power with influence and control on Taiwan. And I think if you look at Taiwan politics right now, the KMT, which is Chiang Kai-shek's old party, is actually positioned to win the elections. And that party is a strong advocate for peaceful reunification with Beijing. And the Democratic People's Party, the pro-Japanese party, has actually dropped independence from its platform because they know the population in Taiwan doesn't want that. Both Chinese on the mainland and in Taiwan share a very similar aspiration. That aspiration is to live in some society in the future that resembles Singapore. We don't understand that because we're caught up in this fantasy about liberal democracy. There's nobody over there interested in that. They're interested in prosperity and order, both of them. And if we leave it alone, they will work things out together. China is not an aggressive military power. China is not like the Soviet Union. China is not this hopelessly oppressive, murderous regime as depicted here in the United States. But unfortunately, once again, thanks to the history of the Cold War, there's a lot of ignorance about what is true and not true about both Russia and China. And that puts us in the position where we are now. And remember, you've got a Navy that confronts a world in which submarines and space-based surveillance rule the oceans. Surface vessels are increasingly a thing of the past. We're going to see lots of empty oceans when it comes to warships. Because if you put major warships out there with thousands of men aboard, they're going to be found, targeted, and either neutralized or sunk. The warfare has changed. It's changed on land. It's changed at sea. And we have to come to terms with these things, and people don't want to. What they really want to do is build more ships, build more large capital ships. That puts a lot of money into a lot of people's pockets, but they're frankly not something we need anymore.
Colonel, let me end with this. Obviously, there's a presidential election next year, and a lot of people like me who are interested in foreign policy and interested in electing someone that's not going to lead us towards nuclear war are interested in candidates like Robert F. Kennedy on the left and Donald Trump on the right. But as someone that voted for Trump twice, which I did, I was quite frustrated that so many of the people in charge of Donald Trump's foreign policy team weren't people like Colonel Douglas Macgregor, although you were a senior advisor to the Secretary of Defense. They were people like John Bolton and Mike Pompeo and H.R. McMaster and the like. Is it fool me once, shame on you, fool me twice, shame on me? I mean, I'm curious what you're planning on doing with respect to the presidential race, and how can people who may have your view of foreign policy but feel like they were a little bit burned by the Trump administration and some of the key appointments that he made, how can they be comfortable in casting that vote again?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, presupposing, of course, that we reach those elections without various calamities between now and then that could distort the election cycle. So setting aside all of that, I don't know exactly what will happen with President Trump. I have a lot of affection for him, but I really don't know what his plans are and the kinds of people that he plans to surround himself with. I just don't. I think very highly of R.F. Kennedy Jr., and I'll be frank with you, either of those men would lead what I would call an American First administration, and I would be happy to serve in an American First administration under either of them. But again, that's a long way off. There's a lot of water under the bridge.
Sure.
I still think that we face difficult times ahead for reasons of finance and economics, and also because of the uncertainty in the international environment. You know, I listen to Nassim Taleb talk frequently about black swans. Well, there are lots of black swans. Some of them are in foreign policy. They can come in the form of terrorism or warfare, just as they can come in the form of bankruptcy, bank runs, treasury bond, fire sales, and so forth. I can't predict any of those things right now, but I think we're in for a very bumpy ride. So I wouldn't assume anything at this stage, one way or the other.
Colonel, we're going to have to end it there. It's always a treat to talk with you. Thanks so much for joining me, as always.
Thank you.